Before we begin tonight's episode, a quick reminder to our listeners. The conversations you're about to hear are unscripted opinions and perspectives from our panel, designed to challenge ideas and encourage discussion. On this show, you'll hear viewpoints from across the political and cultural spectrum. Some you may agree with, others you may strongly disagree with. That's the point. Data and Dissonance exists to explore the tension between facts, narratives, and lived experiences in modern America. Our goal isn't to tell you what to think, but to give you the information and perspectives needed to think critically for yourself. Listener discretion and an open mind are advised.
Good evening and welcome back to Data and Dissonance, the show where we separate headlines from reality, narratives from numbers, and noise from what Americans are actually living every day. Because if you've turned on the news lately, you'd think the economy is either collapsing, booming, or somehow both at the same time, depending on which channel you're watching. Gas prices have been easing in many parts of the country. Grocery prices seem to have finally stopped climbing like they were strapped to a rocket, and the markets are showing signs of stability again after years of volatility. On paper, some of the pressure that Americans have been feeling since the inflation spike earlier in the decade appears to be easing, and the political world is already trying to take credit for it. But here's the thing that people at home are still asking. If everything is getting better, why does it still feel like so many families are just barely staying afloat? Mortgage rates are still sitting at levels that make first-time homebuyers feel like they showed up to a poker game with lunch money while everyone else brought suitcases of cash. Insurance costs, from homes to cars, have been quietly exploding in the background. Rent in many cities is still punishing, and wages, while rising, still feel like they're running a marathon trying to catch up to the cost of living that sprinted ahead a few years ago. So tonight we're going to dig into the question that a lot of Americans are quietly asking around their kitchen tables. Is the pressure finally easing, or are we just being told it is? Are we actually watching the economy stabilize, or are Americans simply getting used to a new normal where everything costs more and relief is always just a few headlines away but never quite shows up in your bank account? Because somewhere between the government data, the political messaging, the media narratives, and what people see when they swipe their card at the grocery store, there's the truth. And tonight we're going to try to find it. All right. Let's bring in the crew tonight, because this is exactly the kind of conversation where different perspectives matter. Sitting around the table with us, as always, are the voices that make Data and Dissonance what it is. First up is Brian, bringing the MAGA fire as always. Brian tends to see the world through the lens of policy results and economic direction, and he's not shy about giving credit when he thinks leadership is moving the country in the right direction. If there are signs that the American economy is stabilizing, Brian will argue that it's proof certain policies are finally putting the country back on track. Next is Rachel, our independent voice and resident reality check. Rachel tends to look at the data, the lived experience of everyday families, and the gap that often exists between political talking points and what people actually feel when they're paying bills. She's not interested in spin from either side. She's interested in whether Americans are genuinely seeing relief or just hearing about it on television. Then there's Daniel, who never looks at a headline without asking what's happening behind the curtain. Daniel connects the dots between global finance, geopolitical pressures, and the systems most people don't think about: central banks, international markets, and the quiet forces that can move entire economies without most Americans even realizing it. And joining the table tonight is Skylar, bringing the progressive perspective to the conversation. Skylar often focuses on the working class side of these issues: wages, affordability, healthcare, and whether economic policies actually reach the people who need relief the most or mostly benefit the top end of the system. And me, I'm Artie, your host, here to stir the pot just enough to keep the conversation honest. So tonight we're asking a simple question that might have a very complicated answer. Is the pressure finally easing for Americans, or are we just being told it is? Let's find out. All right, let's dig into this, because Americans are getting two very different stories right now, depending on where they're getting their information. On one hand, you've got reports showing gas prices easing in many states, grocery inflation slowing down compared to the spikes we saw a couple years ago, and markets stabilizing after a pretty turbulent stretch. Supporters of the current administration say those trends are proof that the economic policies in place are finally taking effect, and that the country is starting to move back towards stability after years of inflation pressure. But at the same time, if you talk to people in real life, at work, at the grocery store, around the dinner table, a lot of them still feel like they're barely keeping their heads above water. Mortgage rates are still high, Insurance costs are through the roof in many parts of the country, and rent or housing prices remain out of reach for a lot of younger families trying to get started. So the question tonight is really about perception versus reality. Are we actually watching the early stages of a real economic recovery? Or are Americans just adjusting to a new baseline where things cost more and relief feels slower than the headlines suggest? Because historically speaking, economies often take years to fully normalize after inflation spikes like the ones we saw earlier this decade, and the political class on both sides usually tries to claim credit or assign blame long before the average family actually feels a difference in their wallet. So, Brian, let me start with you tonight. From your perspective, are these early signs, lower fuel prices, slower grocery inflation, and steadier markets, real indicators that the country is getting back on track economically, or do you think Americans are still feeling the long tail of the inflation surge and we're not out of the woods yet?
Look, I think what we're starting to see right now is something a lot of Americans have been waiting for since the inflation surge earlier in the decade. And that's the first real signs that the pressure cooker might finally be easing a little. Gas prices coming down matters. Grocery inflation slowing matters. Those two things alone hit working families every single week. So when those numbers start stabilizing, it's not just some statistic buried in an economic report. People actually feel that difference. And a lot of conservatives are arguing that this isn't happening by accident. They believe it's the result of shifting economic priorities, stronger energy production, and a move away from some of the policies that fueled inflation in the first place. Energy independence alone has a ripple effect across the entire economy because when fuel stabilizes, transportation costs stabilize, and that eventually helps bring down prices on everything from groceries to building materials. But that said, I'm not going to sit here and pretend everything is magically fixed because it clearly isn't. Housing is still a massive problem in this country. Mortgage rates are still high compared to what people got used to during the ultra-low interest years, and that's locking a lot of younger Americans out of the housing market entirely. Insurance costs are another thing nobody in Washington seems to want to talk about. Auto insurance, homeowners insurance, all of it has been climbing quietly in the background while everyone argues about gas and groceries. So I think what we're seeing right now is the early stages of stabilization, not the finish line. The inflation spike did real damage, and economies don't just snap back overnight. But the trend line starting to move in the right direction is at least a sign that the ship might finally be turning. And for a lot of Americans who have been squeezed for years, that alone is something worth paying attention to.
Brian makes an interesting point there, and I think a lot of Americans would probably agree with at least part of that. When gas prices start easing even a little bit, people notice. When the grocery bill finally stops jumping every single week, people notice that too. Those are the two places where inflation really punches families in the face because they're unavoidable expenses. Everyone has to drive somewhere and everyone has to eat. So when those numbers stabilize, even slightly, it can feel like the pressure valve might finally be loosening after years of everything getting more expensive all at once. And historically speaking, Brian's right about one thing. Economic recoveries rarely feel dramatic when they start. They usually begin slowly, with a few indicators turning positive while other areas are still lagging behind. But at the same time, I think there's another side to this conversation that can't be ignored. Because while gas and groceries might be stabilizing, the big ticket items that shape people's long term financial future still feel incredibly tight. Housing is still brutal in a lot of places. Interest rates are still sitting at levels that make borrowing money painful. And insurance, whether it's car insurance or homeowners, seems to be quietly climbing in the background without anyone really explaining why. So the question becomes, are Americans actually experiencing recovery yet? Or are we just seeing the very early signs of it while the majority of families are still trying to recover from the hit they took over the last few years? Rachel, let me bring you in here. From your perspective, as someone who tends to focus on what everyday families are experiencing rather than just what the economic reports say, do you think Americans are actually starting to feel relief right now? Or are we still in that phase where the numbers might look better on paper, but real life hasn't caught up yet?
I think Brian is right about one thing. There are definitely some indicators that suggest the worst part of the inflation surge might be behind us. When fuel prices come down and grocery inflation slows, that does help people, and we shouldn't pretend it doesn't. Those two categories hit households constantly, and for a while it felt like every trip to the store or the pump came with a new wave of sticker shock. But I also think there's a danger in looking at a few improving indicators and assuming that means families are suddenly doing okay again. A lot of people are still living with the financial aftershocks of what happened over the past few years. Savings that people built during the pandemic years were burned through pretty quickly when inflation spiked. Credit card balances went up across the country as people tried to bridge the gap between wages and rising costs. So even if prices stabilize, a lot of families are still carrying the debt and financial stress that came with that period. And then there's the structural stuff that hasn't really improved much at all yet. Housing is still one of the biggest barriers for younger Americans trying to build a future. Rent is still high in a lot of places, and mortgage rates have made homeownership feel out of reach for many first-time buyers. Insurance costs have also become a huge hidden pressure point. People might celebrate saving a few dollars at the pump, but then their car insurance jumps or their homeowner's policy renews at a much higher rate, and suddenly that relief disappears. So I think what we're seeing right now is a mixed picture. Some things are stabilizing, which is good, but stabilization doesn't automatically mean recovery for families who are still trying to dig out from a financial hole. It may take several more years before the average household actually feels like they're back on solid ground again.
Rachel makes a really important point there, and it highlights something that doesn't always get talked about enough in economic conversations: the difference between prices slowing down and prices actually going back down. Inflation easing doesn't mean things suddenly get cheap again. It just means the rate of increase slows. And for a lot of families, the damage was already done when prices surged in the first place. Once your grocery bill jumps 30 or 40% over a couple years, it doesn't magically drop back to what it used to be. So even if inflation cools off, people are still living with that new reality. And it can take years for wages and savings to catch up to where costs moved during that spike. And that's why I think Rachel's point about household debt is important too. A lot of Americans bridged the gap during those years by leaning on credit cards, loans, or draining whatever savings they had built up. So even if some prices stabilize, families may still be paying off the financial consequences of that period. It's like the economy slammed on the brakes, and now everyone is trying to regain their footing while still moving forward. And meanwhile, the political class, the media, and the financial world all try to frame those changes in ways that fit their narrative: recovery, crisis, turnaround, collapse, depending on what story they want to tell them. But Daniel, this is usually where you start looking beyond just domestic policy and start connecting the dots globally, because the US economy doesn't exist in a vacuum. Energy markets, global trade, central banks, geopolitical tensions, all of those things influence what Americans feel at home. So when we see things like fuel prices stabilizing or markets settling down, is that primarily the result of domestic policy decisions here in the United States, or are we watching larger global economic forces shifting behind the scenes that are shaping what's happening here at home?
This is where the conversation gets interesting, because when people talk about the economy, they usually focus on Washington policy or the president's decisions. But the reality is, the system is much bigger than that. The United States sits inside a global financial structure where energy markets, central bank policy, global trade routes, and geopolitical stability all influence what Americans experience at the gas pump or the grocery store. When fuel prices stabilize, for example, it's not just about domestic drilling or policy shifts. It's also about global supply, OPEC decisions, shipping routes, and whether major regions of the world are experiencing conflict or stability. The same thing applies to inflation and interest rates. Central banks around the world have spent years tightening monetary policy to try to slow inflation, and that affects everything from borrowing costs to investment flows across the entire global system. Another piece people don't always think about is the way financial markets anticipate change before it actually hits the real economy. Markets often stabilize before everyday prices do, because investors are looking months or even years ahead. If markets believe inflation is cooling, and central banks may eventually loosen interest rates, you start to see calmer market behavior even while households are still feeling the after effects. That's why you sometimes get this strange disconnect, where economists say conditions are improving while people at the grocery store say it still feels expensive. Both can be true at the same time. The financial system moves first, Then the real-world effects slowly filter down to consumers. And there's another layer to all of this that's been developing over the past few years: the growing geopolitical competition between global economic blocs. Countries like China and Russia, along with alliances like BRICS, have been trying to shift parts of the global financial system away from Western dominance. That doesn't mean the US economy is collapsing or anything dramatic like that, but it does mean we're entering a more competitive global economic environment. In that kind of environment, stability becomes incredibly valuable. If markets are calming and energy supply chains are stabilizing, that can create a temporary window where pressure eases for American consumers. But the bigger question is whether that stability lasts. Because in a world where economic competition is intensifying, those calm periods can sometimes be shorter than people expect.
Daniel always zooms the camera out to 30,000 feet, and I think that perspective matters because it reminds us that the American economy doesn't operate inside a bubble. Energy markets, global trade, financial systems, all of that plays into what eventually shows up in people's daily lives. And historically, he's right about something else too. Markets often stabilize before the average family feels any real improvement. Investors start reacting to future expectations, while households are still dealing with the reality of prices that already jumped and haven't come back down. So that disconnect between what economists say and what people feel isn't unusual. It's actually something that happens in a lot of economic cycles. But the part of this conversation that really matters is the human side of it, because the average American isn't tracking global financial shifts or watching bond markets. They're looking at their paycheck, their rent or mortgage, their grocery bill, their insurance payment, and trying to figure out if they're moving forward or just treading water. And for many families, especially younger workers and people in the middle or lower income brackets, the past few years have felt like a constant financial balancing act. Even if some of the pressure is easing, the question is whether that easing is actually reaching the people who need relief the most. So, Skylar, let me bring you in here. From the progressive side of this conversation, there's often a focus on wage growth, affordability, and the broader working class experience. When you look at what's happening right now, fuel stabilizing, grocery inflation slowing, but housing, insurance, and borrowing costs still high. Do you think the system is actually starting to stabilize for everyday workers? Or are we seeing a situation where the economic indicators improve while working families are still struggling to keep up?
I think the key phrase in this entire conversation is something Rachel mentioned earlier. Stabilization doesn't mean recovery for the people who are still trying to climb out of the hole that inflation created. Yes, gas prices easing is good. Yes, grocery inflation slowing is good. Nobody's going to argue that those things don't help families. But the problem is that for millions of Americans, the biggest financial pressures they face aren't the things that have stabilized. It's the things that haven't. Housing costs remain one of the most brutal barriers in the economy right now. If you're a young family trying to buy your first home, mortgage rates are still high enough that the same house costs hundreds more per month than it would have just a few years ago. And if you're renting, landlords often raised rents during the inflation surge, and those rarely go back down. Then you look at healthcare, childcare, insurance, and education costs. All of these things have continued rising quietly while the public debate focuses mostly on fuel and groceries. For working class families, those long-term expenses shape their entire financial future. So even if the economy is stabilizing from a macro perspective, a lot of people are still stuck in survival mode financially. That's why you see such a gap between economic reports and public sentiment. Economists might say the trend lines are improving, but if someone's rent jumped, their insurance increased, and they're carrying more credit card debt than they had 3 years ago, that improvement doesn't feel real yet. From a progressive perspective, the question isn't just whether the economy is stabilizing, it's whether the benefits of that stabilization are actually reaching the people who have been hit the hardest.
And I think that's really where the heart of this conversation sits tonight. Because if you listen to everything we've heard around the table, there's actually a surprising amount of overlap, even though the perspectives are different. Brian is pointing to early signs that some of the economic pressure might finally be easing. Rachel is reminding us that stabilization doesn't erase the damage that inflation already caused to household finances. Daniel is zooming out and pointing to the global forces that shape our economy, whether we like it or not. And Skylar is highlighting the reality that the biggest costs in people's lives, housing, healthcare, insurance, education, are still putting enormous pressure on working families. And maybe the truth, like it often is on this show, sits somewhere in the middle of all of that. The numbers might be improving in some areas. The worst part of the inflation surge may very well be behind us. But that doesn't mean Americans automatically feel like they're thriving again. Economic recoveries tend to move slowly through the system, and sometimes the statistics improve long before people actually feel relief in their day-to-day lives. For a lot of families right now, the question isn't whether the economy is technically stabilizing, it's whether their own financial situation is stabilizing. So maybe the better way to frame tonight's question is this: are we seeing the beginning of a recovery? Or are Americans simply adapting to a new economic normal where everything costs more and stability just means the situation isn't getting worse anymore? That's a question the country is going to keep wrestling with for a while.
All right, before we wrap things up tonight, let's take a quick second to talk about something a little more fun than inflation charts and mortgage rates. If you've been listening to Data and Dissonance for a while, you know the show has its own growing merch lineup. And honestly, some of it is pretty great. Whether you're looking for hoodies, hats, mugs, bumper stickers, tote bags, or even the Gen X gear that a lot of listeners have been grabbing lately, it's all designed around the same idea this show is built on: speaking your mind, thinking for yourself, and maybe stirring the pot just a little bit while you're at it. And of course, we've also got the Data and Dissonance coffee lineup, which is honestly perfect for mornings when you're trying to survive the news cycle. There's the High Lakes Light Roast, the Rock Creek Medium Roast, and the Bitterroot Dark French Roast, all roasted right here in the US and available in whole bean or ground. So whether you're starting your day, heading to work, or just getting ready to argue with your friends about politics and culture, we've got the coffee for it. If you want to check it all out, head over to the Data and Dissonance merch store. Browse around, grab something you like, and support the show while you're at it. Because if you're going to debate the future of the country, you might as well do it with good coffee.
You know, one of the things I've always believed about this show is that the truth usually lives somewhere between the headlines and the reality people are living every day. Governments release numbers, economists analyze trends, politicians claim victory or assign blame, and media outlets build narratives around those things. But at the end of the day, most Americans don't experience the economy through charts or policy debates. They experience it when they swipe their card at the grocery store, when they fill up their truck at the gas pump, when they sit down with their spouse and look at the mortgage payment, the rent check, the insurance bill, or the credit card statement. That's where the real economy lives. Not in the press conferences, but in the kitchen conversations happening all across the country. And what tonight's conversation really highlights is that we may be entering a moment where two things can be true at the same time. The data may show that some pressures are finally easing. The worst part of the inflation surge may be behind us. Certain indicators might be moving in the right direction again. But for millions of Americans, the financial damage that happened over the past few years hasn't simply disappeared. Prices jumped and stayed there, savings were drained, debt went up. And rebuilding financial stability takes time, often more time than political cycles or media narratives are willing to acknowledge. The bigger question for the country going forward is whether this period of stabilization becomes something stronger. Does it turn into real recovery where families can actually rebuild savings, buy homes again, feel secure about their future? Or do we settle into a new normal where the cost of living simply stays higher and people gradually adapt to it? Because stability is important, but prosperity is something different. Stability means the storm has slowed down. Prosperity means the sun actually comes back out. And maybe that's the real test of leadership and policy over the next few years, not just stabilizing the numbers on a spreadsheet, but restoring a sense of economic momentum for everyday Americans who want to feel like hard work actually moves them forward again. Because when the average family feels confident about their future, that's when a country is truly strong. And that's the conversation we'll keep having here. Thanks for listening tonight, and remember, speak truth, stir thought.
Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series, written by our very own host, Artie. If you enjoy the kind of big picture conversations we have here about power, global tension, hidden agendas, and the forces shaping the modern world, you'll probably love this series. The books follow intelligence operative Caleb Rourke as he navigates international conspiracies, covert operations, and the dangerous intersection between politics, technology, and global power. It's fast-paced, grounded in real geopolitical tension, and written for readers who enjoy thrillers that feel just a little too close to reality. You can start the series today with The Covenant Protocol, continue the story in The Prophet Directive, and the third installment, Black Echo Rising. If you're into high-stakes thrillers, espionage, and the kind of stories that make you question what's really happening behind the scenes, this series is definitely worth checking out. And while you're at it, don't forget to check out the music connected to the Data and Dissonance universe as well. The album Uncaged dropped last year and features tracks built around themes of freedom, resilience, and speaking your mind in a world that increasingly pressures people to stay quiet. And just recently, a brand new country album dropped, Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, celebrating small towns, faith, freedom, and the American spirit. It's a mix of country storytelling and patriotic energy that fits perfectly with the conversations we have here on the show. Both the books and the music are available now, and you can find all the links in the episode description. Support the stories, support the music, support independent creators who are willing to speak their minds.